They say the dark is empty, but I've seen it breathe and smile. These are the stories of what comes hunting when the sun goes down. Tonight, Dread Scribe writes again. The forest at dusk has a strange kind of beauty, the kind that makes you forget how quickly beauty can become menace. The air smelled of damp earth and pine resin, thick and heavy, like the breath of something ancient. My boots crunched over gravel, each step deliberate as I followed a narrow trail winding between towering pines. The sun had slipped behind the hills minutes ago, leaving only a thin smear of crimson on the horizon. That's when I heard it. The soft, measured crunch of another pair of boots, perfectly mirroring mine. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Sound travels strangely in the woods. Echoes bounce between tree trunks like ricocheting bullets, especially when the temperature drops and the air grows dense. I even recalled a lecture I'd once attended about auditory illusions, how the brain, craving patterns, can twist random noises into the shape of familiarity. I repeated this to myself like a mantra. Science is light, I thought. Fear is only darkness. But no matter how many rational explanations I stacked in my mind, none of them could explain why the footsteps paused exactly when I paused. I froze mid-stride, holding my breath until my lungs burned. The forest responded with silence, the kind so absolute it made my ears ring. For a moment, I believed I'd imagined it. Relief fluttered in my chest like a fragile moth. Then, a split second later, a single crunch came from behind me. One step, slow and deliberate. The moth of relief turned instantly to a thorn of terror. The fog began to rise as night claimed the forest, curling around the trees like pale smoke. It blurred shapes, softened edges, and turned the world into a half-forgotten dream. I pushed forward, telling myself I'd simply quicken my pace, reach the main trail, and shake off this childish fear. But the footsteps behind me matched perfectly, a shadow rhythm twinned to my own. Faster, slower, soft, loud. Whatever I did, it followed. It was like walking beside an echo that had learned how to breathe. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out the forest's usual chorus of insects and night birds. Every rational thought frayed, unraveling under the weight of a deeper instinct. I was being hunted. Still, my mind clung to scraps of reason. Maybe it was another hiker, I argued silently. Maybe they were lost or nervous or playing some cruel joke. Humans fear what they can't name, and naming is a kind of control. But when I finally gathered the courage to glance over my shoulder, what I saw stole even the illusion of control. Through the fog, about 20 feet back, stood a silhouette. Tall, motionless, wrong. The mist clung to it like a second skin, refusing to reveal detail. My breath caught in my throat as a terrible realization took root. I had stopped walking, yet the figure had not stopped appearing. It didn't sway like a human trying to balance. It didn't fidget or breathe. It simply existed, a void carved, out of the world. I turned and ran. Branches lashed my arms, and cold air burned my lungs. Behind me, the footsteps surged into a chaotic, pounding rhythm, no longer mimicking, chasing. The trail ahead dissolved into fog, and for one terrible moment, I felt the forest itself closing in, as if the trees were leaning closer to listen. Then, clear as my own heartbeat, a whisper floated through the mist. It was my voice, calling my name. My name, in my own voice, threaded through the mist like a live wire, and something inside me tightened around it. I stopped so abruptly my knees locked, and the forest leaned in with wet bark and cold patience. A twig ticked against another, small as a wristwatch, second-hand, yet the air kept the shape of my syllables as if the fog could remember. I whispered back once, testing the surface the way you test ice with a cautious heel. The sound returned softer, careful, as though it didn't want to startle me. It felt like a hand hovering over my shoulder without touching. I told myself about predictive coding, how the brain forecasts what it expects to hear, filling gaps like a tidy forger. Infrasound can ride the bellies of trunks, turning distance into nearness. Low frequencies bend around obstacles the way rivers bend around stones. Maybe my breath had looped, my exhalation curling back with my name attached like a tag. But what I didn't expect was the shift that followed. A second whisper, still mine, nearer and lower, as if my mouth had been set just behind my left ear. It spoke my name again, like a password it had stolen and now wore, and the syllables slid under my skin like a thin blade of cold. I turned slowly. The fog became a stitched curtain, seams of darkness between the trees, moonlight snagged like silver thread. Nothing moved. The metallic taste in my throat reminded me of biting a coin, and with it came a memory of my mother teaching me to count when fear scattered my thoughts. I counted to 10 and then to 20, a fragile spell restoring edges to things. Courage felt like a match cupped in wind. But what answered my counting wasn't courage. It was a footfall pacing me inside the hush, landing exactly when a pulse climbed my wrist, as if my body had acquired a second rhythm. The forest inhaled and exhaled around me like a sleeping animal that had not decided to dream me harmless. I lowered my light and saw a second trail beside mine, fresh, crisp, the same boot tread, the same inward tilt, the same habit of clipping the heel on rocks. The prints veered off the path and rejoined, as if their maker had tried alternate futures and chosen the least forgiving one. Every depression was a negative photograph of my body, pressed into mud like a signature on wet paper. It felt like finding my name on a contract I don't remember signing, the clauses unread. I tried an experiment. I clapped an irregular pattern, two quick, one slow, then silence. The footsteps matched, then added a beat half a second late, a phase shift, like two pendulums negotiating. Please, it said next, my voice trimmed to a child's edge, the plea I never allow to escape. I didn't ask who was there, that's the oldest trap. Instead, I said I'm lost, and my words rose into the crowns like smoke. The silhouette pooled out of the fog again, closer now, angles where no joints should be. My phone's light shrank to a coin, but the bark beside me gleamed, with sets of 3 scratches. A breath grazed my neck, synchronized with my own. Don't turn around, it murmured so softly in my tone, as my footsteps moved ahead without me. The forest was sinking into night when I first saw the light. It appeared between the black columns of pine trunks, a faint yellow glow swaying gently, as though someone carried a lantern through the mist. At first I thought it was a hiker heading back to the trailhead, maybe a camper taking a late walk. The rational part of me clung to that explanation like a lifeline. But there was something hypnotic about the way it moved, too smooth, too perfectly timed, like a metronome keeping rhythm in a song only it could hear. The deeper I stared, the more it pulled at me. It reminded me of childhood summers when I chased fireflies through my grandparents' fields, that same giddy thrill of running toward light in the dark. I remember my grandfather warning me, curiosity can be a lantern, but it can also be a lure. His words fluttered through my mind now, faint as moth wings, as I found myself stepping off the marked trail. The dirt was soft beneath my boots, pine needles whispering under each step, the night air thick with the resinous smell of sap. Behind me, the safety of the trail dissolved into a single straight line, swallowed by fog. As I walked, I tried to anchor myself with science. I told myself about swamp gas, how methane rising from decaying vegetation can sometimes ignite and hover eerily above the ground, producing lights that folklore once called will-o'-the-wisps. I thought of bioluminescent fungi glowing faintly on rotting wood, the way nature tricks our senses with chemical magic. These explanations were comforting, like ropes tied to the shore. But every time I repeated them, the light ahead seemed to mock me. It didn't flicker randomly like fire or fungus. It pulsed. The rhythm was too precise, almost like Morse code. 3 long blinks, 2 short, then darkness before it flared again. My breath caught as an odd idea surfaced. What if it wasn't a phenomenon at all, but a signal? The forest pressed closer around me, the pines crowding together like a silent audience. Even the wind had stilled, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat, ragged and uneven. I should have turned back then, but wonder has teeth. I kept walking, unable to stop, as though the light had reached inside my mind and tugged at some old reckless thread of curiosity. The ground grew uneven, riddled with roots that seemed to grab at my ankles. At one point, I stumbled and caught myself against a tree, my hand sinking into damp moss that felt like the cold skin of some buried creature. When I looked up, the lantern was closer, too close. It hung there, hovering in the fog not 10 feet away, yet no figure held it. The glow illuminated nothing except the mist itself, turning the air into liquid gold. My mouth went dry as a single, horrifying thought bloomed. Perhaps it had never been ahead of me at all, but beside me, leading me deeper like a shepherd guiding prey. Then, in an instant, the light vanished. Darkness slammed down with the weight of a closing door. My breath erupted in the void, shallow and panicked, as the crushing realization struck me. I didn't know which direction I'd come from, and in the suffocating blackness, I heard a second set of footsteps, careful and deliberate, just feathered the leaf litter with a patience that felt personal, as if the darkness had chosen a tempo just for me. I steadied my breathing and held the phone close enough that its black screen reflected a faint smear of my face, then refused to wake. The night pressed on my cheeks like velvet over a mouth. Somewhere to my right, a small stone skittered, the kind of sound gravity makes when it's being watched. But what I didn't expect was the hush that followed, a deliberate pause that listened back. I lifted the compass app at last, a weak blue ring stuttering, the needle wandering like a drunk bee. Magnetometers can drift near buried iron or mineral seams. Quartz under pressure can sing. Even the planet's field wavers when solar winds comb it. I told myself these facts the way a child recites multiplication tables to keep nightmares polite. My eyes adjusted to mesopic vision. Colors bled toward blue-green, that Purkinje shift where yellow dies first. In the damp, resin sweet as syrup, I scratched a bark notch with my pocket blade, a breadcrumb that wouldn't blow away. The footsteps answered with another, then stillness, like a chess player lifting a hand over the board. A faint glow returned ahead, not a shape, only a heartbeat. In the fog, it pulsed 3 slow, 2 quick, then rested as if counting my breaths. Heart rate variability spikes under fear. The vagus nerve choreographs tiny irregularities like tremors under a lake. The light matched me, then led me, then waited for me to catch up. A lure that studies its fish is more net than flame. But what it didn't anticipate was my decision to circle wide, eyes low, reading ground more than sky. 2 tracks stitched the soil, mine and another narrower tread, the forefoot. Deeper, a hurry written in mud, pine needles tufted at the edges like frayed thread. A ribbon of red yarn lay snagged on a bramble, bright as a fresh wound even in the dim. Memory flickered. Childhood fields, fireflies cupped in my palms, the friend who always ran first and farthest, braver until she wasn't. Awe and regret walked beside me like mismatched twins. I cupped my hands and called once, small and careful, a syllable that felt like throwing a pebble into a well I couldn't measure. Light slashed sideways, a cold LED blade, not the lantern's gold. A figure resolved out of the fog, a woman, about my age, jacket slick with dew, eyes reflecting like an animal at the edge of a road. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her shoulders told me she had also stepped off safety for wonder. We stood there, 2 moths embarrassed by the candle. She gestured at the pulsing glow, and then at me, a question shaped by her breath. In that quiet exchange, I felt a small, stubborn hope climb my ribs like ivy. The lantern returned between us, nearer than physics should allow, blooming from the center of the mist. 3 long, 2 short, again and again, the cadence of an invitation pretending to be a map. A pressure gathered low in the air, a sub-bass hum you feel in cartilage and teeth. Infrasound can curl guts and sharpen dread like vinegar on metal. The trees seemed to lean without moving. But what the lantern didn't expect was our refusal to step closer. We held. I tested parallax with a thrown stick. The glow should have shifted against trunks. It didn't. Fog droplets can scatter light, but this felt volumetric, as if the air itself had learned to shine. The woman's beam crossed the gold, and instead of washing it out, the two lights braided like currents, knotting the path into a bright lie. A whisper of footfalls multiplied around us, not echoes but arrivals, pads and heels composing a circlet. Needles trembled, cones tapped branches like knuckles on doors. I tilted my phone again, and in the briefly awakened glass I caught our reflections and a third shape behind us, taller than either, faceless because fog had decided it should be. The ground at my feet held 3 sets of prints now, the newest pressed clean and wet. The stride a patient parenthesis around our fear. The lantern swelled, dimmed, swelled, the rhythm eager. A breath touched the back of my neck that wasn't wind. I realized the pattern had never guided a route, it had harvested a radius. And that's when the truth slid cold and simple into place. I wasn't the only one following that light tonight, and the footsteps closing in didn't belong to either of us. The forest at night feels like another planet, one where the laws of sound and shadow are rewritten with every passing hour. My small campfire hissed softly, spitting embers into the air like fireflies trying to escape. The circle of light it cast felt fragile, a soap bubble against the endless dark. Beyond it, the pines crowded close, their black spires knitting together into a ceiling that hid the stars. I had camped alone before, but never this deep, never this far from the reassuring hum of roads and towns. Here, the silence wasn't empty. It was watchful. That silence shattered with a howl so guttural it rattled my bones. It wasn't the clean, high-pitched cry of a coyote or the wavering call of a distant wolf pack. This sound was rough, layered, almost human in its anger. It started low, like the rumble of a distant storm, then rose sharply, curving upward in a way that made my skin crawl. My rational mind scrambled for answers, flipping through the index of sounds I'd learned from documentaries and park ranger guides. Wolves can mimic strange patterns. Owls can scream like women in distress. Even mountain lions, when panicked, can sound uncannily like a child. But this wasn't any of those. This howl seemed designed to exploit something buried deep in me, an evolutionary alarm system older than language. It was the sound of prey being reminded what it means to be prey. I felt my pulse spike, a primitive drumbeat urging me to run, but I stayed frozen, gripping my knees, my breath shallow. The fire crackled behind me, mocking my stillness with its restless movement. When the howl came again, it was closer, much closer. The scent followed a moment later, a thick, musky odor, sharp and feral, like wet fur mixed with rusted iron. I gagged, my throat tightening against the invasion of it. This wasn't just an animal passing by. Whatever was out there was circling me. I could hear it now, heavy footfalls breaking branches in a slow, deliberate pattern. The rhythm reminded me of a predator pacing the edge of a zoo enclosure, except this cage was inverted. I was trapped inside, and the wild was free. My mind, desperate for structure, latched onto a story I'd once dismissed as campfire nonsense. The legend of the Dogman, part wolf, part man, a relic of ancient fears roaming the shadowed edges of civilization. Scientists explain these tales as evolutionary carryovers, symbols of hybrid terror coded into our DNA. We fear creatures that blur the line between human and beast because they challenge our fragile sense of superiority. I repeated that explanation silently, like an incantation, but it didn't slow my pounding heart. The firelight began to falter, shrinking as if some unseen force were drinking it in. In the dimming glow, I saw movement at the tree line, 2 enormous eyes catching the last flickers of flame. They weren't reflective like a deer's. They burned faintly, amber red, as though lit from within. My breath hitched, and the night seemed to lean closer. Then came the sound that shattered any pretense of safety. A deep guttural growl, so near it vibrated the thin nylon wall of my tent. It wasn't just outside my camp, it was inches from me. The growl shouldered through the tent wall like thunder, traveling bone to bone, and the nylon quivered as if it had learned to breathe. A smell rode the dark, wet fur, carrion sweetness, a metallic bite that stung like a scraped knee, and it settled in the back of my throat where language fails. My palm hovered over the zipper, knowing the smallest rasp could translate as prey. Outside, something shifted its weight, not impatient but curious, as though choosing which version of me it would meet first. Ash collapsed in the pit. The sound, so soft it felt like memory remembering itself. Instinct pinned me in place. The old mammalian freeze dropped my pulse to a quiet metronome, a trick evolution teaches prey so night will glance past. Predators read motion the way we read handwriting. Stillness is a disguise stitched without thread. I counted the gap between its breaths, each exhale a damp ribbon smoothing the fabric. In the last ember glow, shadows climbed the tent like spilled ink, learning to grow legs. But a heavier question gathered under the silence. What if the breath I tracked belonged to more than one chest? I thought of the uncle who taught me to camp, his laugh like dry leaves skittering down pavement. He would say fear is focus with bad manners, then strike sparks until one found listening tinder. He died last winter, a quiet exit in a loud world, and I kept his flint like a saint's bone. Grief can be ballast, I told myself. I slid the striker along steel, a kiss that birthed a small sun, and smoke curled from the fibers like a sealed letter opening to read me back. The growl hiccuped into silence. I lifted the flap 2 fingers width and saw them. Eyes, low at first, then rising, as if the ground had taught the body above them to stand. Deer shine jade and coyotes green. These burned amber from within, pupils tightening to knives. Science tugged at my sleeve. Tapetum lucidum, infrasound, sensory bias, but wonder bared its teeth. The fire brightened and the shape clarified. 2 barrel-chested for wolf, 2 long and 4-limb for man, legs bent for running with the hips of a ring of howls, throats triangulating space the way surveyors map land. Chorusing does more than locate, it fences, drawing borders where teeth intend to follow. I banged my titanium mug with a stake, a crude bell spun. From panic, and the nearest shadow flinched but held. Pressure gathered low, bass you feel in cartilage. The flame guttered as if a hand had cupped it. But what they didn't expect was stepping into the open to choose my ground. I rose with the flaming bundle on a stick, ridiculous and holy, and the figure inhaled, savoring spark and salt. Digitigrade, heavy-shouldered, 4 limbs like questions. No one dares answer. It wore the efficiency of a design field tested by hunger. Evolution favors what works. Myth favors what explains. Here they converged like 2 rivers crossing, and awe turned carnivorous. Between the trunks, more shadows, detached where no branches swayed. My fire faded to a bruise of light. Something leaned against the tent behind me, and the zipper ticked once under weight that hadn't been there moments ago. I did not turn. I listened. The first creature's breath combed the hair on my forearms, and a second, lighter cadence answered from the camp's center, where my sleeping bag still held a warm hollow the shape of my body. Prints dented the dust near my boot, longer than any wolf's, toes splayed like a hand. The eyes in the trees multiplied until the tree line looked strung with furnace coals. The nearest muzzle lifted, tasting the night, for salt, for smoke, for me. The next sound was small and intimate, a sniff just behind my ear, as though the dark had learned my name. The desert night has a way of swallowing sound, holding it in its mouth like a secret. The air was dry and metallic, carrying the faint smell of creosote and sandstone. I sat by the dwindling campfire with Ranger Kesh, his weathered face lit in bursts of orange glow, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. He had been silent for most of the evening, Until finally he said in a voice low enough to almost blend with the crackle of the flames, "Never whistle at night." The words felt like a fragment of superstition, something old and fragile passed down like a family heirloom. I laughed, not unkindly, and asked him why. He didn't laugh back. Instead, he turned his head slowly, scanning the line of cliffs silhouetted by a rising moon. "Because," he said, "you might get an answer." There was weight to the statement, a subtle gravity that made me uncomfortable. As an outsider and someone with a background in anthropology, I wanted to frame his warning in terms of folklore. Skinwalker stories, I told myself, are a narrative vessel, a way for communities to process fear, grief, and the unpredictable violence of the natural world. I even recited what I'd read in journals, tales of witches who could become animals, wearing skins like masks. The idea of transformation as both punishment and power. These myths serve to explain the unexplainable. They are metaphor, not reality. Kesh didn't argue with me, but his silence felt heavier than disagreement. He simply rose, tossed sand on the fire, and said he was going to his tent. "You're on your own now," he added, his tone unreadable. The night deepened after he left. With no fire, the desert was lit only by moonlight, a cold blue-silver glow that painted the rocks like frozen waves. I sat alone, restless and stubborn, replaying his warning in my mind. Never whistle at night. It sounded like a challenge more than a prohibition. My rational brain clung to the idea that fear only has power when we feed it. I pursed my lips and gave a sharp, quick whistle, the sound cutting cleanly through the stillness like a thrown blade. The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, I almost felt triumphant. Then, from the darkness beyond the cliffs came an answering whistle, perfectly identical to mine. My heart stopped cold. It wasn't just similar. It was a mirror. The tone, the length, the exact pitch returned to me as though the night had memorized my breath. I told myself it had to be an echo, a simple acoustic trick, but echoes fade and distort. This one was flawless. I stood, my body buzzing with adrenaline. The sand shifted beneath my boots, whispering like distant voices. Then I heard something that shattered the last fragile layer of skepticism. A voice, my own voice, emerging from the dark. It didn't shout. It didn't even speak a sentence. It just whispered my name, slow and deliberate, tasting it like a promise. The desert seemed to lean closer, waiting to see what I would do next. The desert leaned closer, waiting to see what I would do next. I kept my lips shut, pressing my tongue against the roof of my mouth until the urge to answer thinned like smoke. My name came again, perfectly sewn to my breath, a needle returning to the same hole. I tried to balance wonder with math. Concave. Cliffs can focus sound. Temperature inversions can carry voices farther than they deserve, and memory can lace silence with words. Yet the cadence was intimate, trimmed to my exact inhale, as if the night had practiced wearing me. I set a test and puckered 3 sharp notes I had never used, then stood still with my pulse ticking like a moth in a jar. The answer came 3 notes in a long glide, my own timbre wearing a grin. Echoes smear, but this reply felt freshly minted. I moved sideways along the arroyo's seam, dragging my boot to mark a line. If it were reflection, the source would pivot as I did. It didn't pivot. It followed, patient as a herder, nudging me toward the canyon's throat, a shape unstitched from the boulders and arranged itself into uncertainty. The smell arrived first, dust, wet stone, and a rotten sweetness like fruit left in a locked car, followed by the tiniest scrape, as if a nail tested the skin of the night. I reached for the scaffolding of training, folklore as social grammar, myths as maps of danger, the psychology of mimicry. Belief, I'd argued, bends perception, but what none of my books expected was the relief belief offered. If a monster is a story, then a story has rules. Kesh's tent zipper whispered, and he stepped into the moonwash with a stillness I recognized from people who have seen a thing and accepted its price. He didn't call to me. He lifted a palm and scattered 3 arcs of sand, grains flashing like frost. Later I would learn about ceremonies, about stories that are not mine to carry. In that moment he was only a man asking the dark to show its boundaries. The voice wearing my voice hesitated, thinning to a reed, then whistled from higher in the canyon. Another whistle answered it, younger and hurried, repeating my pattern in bursts like a heartbeat climbing stairs. For a breath we listened, 3 points on an unseen triangle. Me, the mimic, and whatever had just learned to be afraid. Kesh nodded toward the sound, not an order, a permission. We moved along the wash, moonlight gliding over slick rock like poured milk. But what the night didn't expect was our refusal to run. We walked steady, as if fear were a dog that chases the sprinting back. Dawn found us at a throat of sandstone where the wash narrowed and the echoes learned manners. In the pale light we saw tracks braided into the dust, bare human feet interleaved, with coyote prints, spiraling, separating, then breaking into a sprint across the varnished slab. My urge was to tame it with labels, cryptid, psychosis, misheard echo, but the words slid off like decals on hot metal. Kesh packed without commentary, eyes soft with an old grief, while my phone buzzed awake and played a file I hadn't recorded, my whistle, beckoning. Some things don't need belief to exist. It isn't just absence. It's the way silence gathers in places where voices should be. In the last 5 years, 16 hikers have gone missing in this national forest. On paper, their cases are scattered, wrong. Turns, sudden storms, freak accidents. But when I spread their locations across a map, the dots connect like stitches forming a wound. Each vanishing occurs within a narrow ring of terrain that search and rescue teams have combed endlessly without result. Statistics should provide comfort, but here they only deepen the unease. I came because I couldn't stand reading about it anymore. One of the missing was a college student named Mia Torres. She wasn't just another statistic, she was my cousin. She disappeared last spring during a weekend hike with 2 friends. Their story never made sense. One moment Mia was just behind them on the trail, laughing about the weight of her pack. The next, the trail was empty, her laughter swallowed mid-breath. They found no tracks, no sign of struggle, nothing but a faint smell of wood smoke that vanished before rangers arrived. Search and rescue operates like a machine. Grid sweeps, GPS markers, heat-seeking drones, cadaver dogs. They'd deployed every tool available. And yet, in these woods, the machine falters. Dogs whine and refuse to cross certain streams. GPS units freeze as if the satellites forget this. Place exists. The protocols are flawless, but the forest plays by rules older than maps. I told myself my investigation would be different. I wasn't here to rescue. I was here to understand. By late afternoon, my pack was heavy with notes and marked up trail guides. The sun dipped, and shadows slid between the trees like ink poured into water. I reached a clearing I didn't recognize, a small bowl of grass surrounded by leaning pines. It wasn't on any of my maps, though the ground bore evidence of recent use. A fire pit, carefully ringed with stones, still faintly warm to the touch. A half-buried cooler, a plastic mug tipped on its side, rim streaked with coffee. And then, the shoe. It sat upright in the middle of the clearing, laces neatly tied, the tongue slightly bent forward as though waiting for a foot to slide back inside. My breath caught. It wasn't scuffed or torn, no sign of panic in its removal. It looked deliberate. The kind of stillness that only follows intention. I crouched beside it, tracing the edge with my fingertips, and the earth beneath radiated, a trace of warmth, like a handprint fading on glass. The air thickened. Even the insects had gone silent, their constant background hum abruptly cut. A single pine cone dropped nearby with a sound too loud for its size. My rationality began to fray, unspooling like an old rope. I stood and called out Mia's name, voice trembling. The forest swallowed it whole. Then came the scream. Distant yet piercing, it sliced through the trees in a jagged line, raw and human but stretched thin, as though torn on its way to me. I ran toward it before my mind could object, branches clawing at my arms. Each step carried me deeper into the darkness, chasing a sound that felt like both a plea and a warning. Somewhere ahead something waited, and it had been waiting for far longer than I realized. Branches whipped my sleeves as I chased the scream, the sound skittering across the ravines like a silver fish. I tried to map it by ear, counting the echoes delay between trunk and ridge, triangulating the way instructors teach for search and rescue. Psychoacoustics says our brains anchor to first arrival, but the forest muddied arrivals until they felt like a deck of voices being shuffled. I stopped, listened, moved 10 paces, listened again. The cry came once more, higher, thinner, and then cut off with surgical neatness. But what I didn't expect was the next sound, laughter, brief and brittle, like glass cracking in cold water, coming from exactly where Mia's trail should have reappeared on my map. I reached the ravine, lip and found another clearing, smaller than the first, ringed by spruce like a jury leaning in. The fire pit here was ash-gray and cool, but a circle in the grass still held the oval of a tent, as if a shadow had decided to lie down. 2 metal stakes remained, pulled and replanted upside down. A spoon rested on a rock with a smear of peanut butter. Ants marching the perimeter as if avoiding the center by command. The shoe again, not the same make, but the same posture. Upright, laces tied, waiting. My name rode the wind then, low and uncertain, and for a terrible second it sounded like Mia, older by fear. I forced my breathing to slow and cataloged the scene the way investigators do when adrenaline makes time go slippery. Occam likes simple answers, I told myself. People wander, people get hurt, people panic and shed gear. Yet the neatness undercut panic. It felt curated, like a museum of departures. I took photos, measured stride length between prints in the half-dry soil, and noticed something wrong. The heel impressions pointed inward, as if each step had been placed to return to its own origin. Wind combed the treetops with a sound like distant surf, and under it came a hum, low and electrical, the kind power lines make when fog strings them with beads. A figure stood at the far edge, hardly a figure at all, more a discoloration where the dark had practiced standing. I raised my light and it retreated exactly 1 pace, the way a dream obeys until it doesn't. I spoke Mia's name into the trees, and the forest handed it back with a delay that was not echo so much as decision. But what I didn't expect was the reply that followed, a single word I had never taught it. Help. The syllable wore her rhythm, but the mouth that formed it felt too wide, as if the night had borrowed a jaw. My heart knocked against my ribs, like a trapped moth begging for window glass. I stepped forward anyway, anger outrunning caution, and the clearing tilted like a table with 1 short leg. A warmth lingered in the grass where a body had knelt, and in the center lay a ranger's orange flag, clipped to nothing, the clip polished by fingers. The hum deepened. From the trees to my left, a scream rose, closer, breaking into sobs, then laughter. I turned toward it and saw a second campsite ahead, identical to this one, waiting. The storm came without warning, the kind that seems to rise from the ground rather than fall from the sky. One moment the forest was a cathedral of stillness, the next it was a chaos of sleet and branches, wind howling through the pines like a pack of starving animals. My headlamp beam fractured against the rain, scattering into useless shards of light. I stumbled over roots, my boots sinking into mud that seemed eager to hold me down. Somewhere behind me, the trail I'd been following dissolved into shadow, erased as if it had never existed. My phone had died hours earlier, and my compass needle spun madly, overwhelmed by magnetic interference. Panic began to build in my chest, sharp and fast like a bird trapped in a box. I knew enough about hypothermia to understand how quickly this could turn fatal. I needed shelter, anything to get me out of the cutting wind and freezing rain. Through the blur of water and darkness, a faint glow appeared ahead, warm and steady. My heart leapt. As I drew closer, the shape resolved into a cabin, or at least something shaped like one. Its walls were built from rough-hewn logs, stacked unevenly like teeth, and the entire structure seemed to crouch against the storm. Light glowed softly from within, golden and inviting, yet wrong. There were no windows, no door. Just a single dark opening near the ground, barely wide enough for me to crawl through. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible. No ventilation, no chimney, and yet a fire burned inside. A building with no entry except a hole, like a burrow. But the storm drowned my doubts with another violent gust, and desperation won. I dropped to my knees and crawled inside. Warmth enveloped me immediately, rich and cloying, carrying the faint scent of burnt pine sap and something metallic, like old coins. The interior was impossibly large, as though the walls had stretched the moment I crossed the threshold. My headlamp flickered, then steadied, casting a cold white glow over the space. Every surface of the cabin was carved. The floorboards, the support beams, even the ceiling bore intricate markings, spirals, figures, and symbols etched so deeply they seemed to pulse in the light. I ran my fingers over one set of carvings and recoiled. They weren't decorative. They were narrative. The story they told unfolded in jagged, haunting images. A group of travelers huddled together beneath a storm, a faceless figure standing apart, its arms outstretched like a priest or executioner. Then the travelers scattered, their forms breaking apart into smaller, terrified shapes. In the final carving, only the faceless figure remained, standing over a pile of what looked like bones. My breath quickened. My mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps these were remnants of an ancient ritual, a warning passed down through generations. Anthropologists write about survival myths encoded in symbols, teaching future wanderers how to endure. Maybe this cabin was once a sacred site, a kind of storytelling shrine. Then the light changed. It didn't dim gradually, as a candle might. It snapped off, as if someone had flipped a switch. In the suffocating dark, a new sound emerged. Slow, deliberate breathing. It came from directly behind my neck, and the dark seemed to gain weight around it. Instinct ordered stillness. Freeze is an old mask, a way to convince a hungry world you're stone. My heartbeat argued, loud as a trapped bird. The cabin inhaled with me, seams whispering, rafters creaking like ribs. I raised my headlamp with a surgeon's care, afraid the click would read as invitation. When the beam finally bloomed, it felt less like light than an eye opening inside a mouth. The beam knifed a narrow path. Dust glittered like hoarfrost, and the carvings drank it. They had changed. Where a faceless figure once loomed above scattered travelers, a new panel showed a lone hiker kneeling inside a box. Even the headlamp was etched, a tiny triangle. My breath synced to unseen lungs. Hypoxia can cast puppets. Panic writes plays. Yet the lines kept deepening as I watched, as if a careful hand carved from the far side of the wall. I reached for the opening I'd crawled through and found only wall. The hole had sealed, logs scribed together as neatly as puzzle teeth. Warmth. Pressed from every direction, furnace warm, not welcoming but persuasive, the way a fox den might persuade a rabbit in sleet. The breathing grew louder without getting nearer, as if distance had been subtracted from the room. Bare prints dimpled the floorboards, small, overlapping my boot treads in a sequence that read like edits. The newest impressions pointed toward the beam with the circle of cuts that hadn't existed a minute ago. A steadiness rose that wasn't bravery so much as economy. Panic spends oxygen I couldn't afford. My father once showed me how to notch a sapling without killing it. A careful crescent that taught restraint. I braced my knife and carved a circle into the nearest beam, a closed loop, a refusal. The blade skittered and bit. A bead of blood toppled from my knuckle and struck the wood with the intimacy of a signature. The cabin answered with a sub-bass. Tremor I felt in my teeth, vibrations mapping my skeleton like sonar. Warmth began to pulse, a heartbeat in timber. The roof bowed, the floor subtly tilted, and the layout clarified. The crawl hole was a throat, the rafters a sternum, the chamber a stomach lined with stories. This wasn't shelter. It was an animal disguised as memory. Survival rituals flashed through my mind, offerings to tempests, sacrifices that purchased dawn. I tore pages from my field notebook, the maps of other disappearances, and fed them to the ember sleeping under ash. Smoke wrote cursive in the air, and the carved figures seemed to inhale it like priests sipping incense. A dark oval bled back into the corner where the logs refused to meet. Cold night licked the floorboards, sweet as snow after fever. Beyond, it sleet-scribbled diagonals. I crawled, shoulders scraping, pack-shedding straps like a snake abandoning skin. The breathing followed without moving. I tumbled onto wet leaves and turned. The exterior was smaller than the room had promised. A squat lump under bent pines, no windows, no door. Fresh gouges stitched themselves as I watched, thread lines forming a figure kneeling beneath a storm. The knife was gone. The breath had followed me, and it knew my rhythm. The road home was always lonely, but that night it felt abandoned by the world. My headlights tunneled through darkness, revealing only thin stripes of faded paint and the skeletal silhouettes of trees. It was past midnight, the hour when the landscape forgets it was ever alive. The hum of the engine was my only companion, steady and monotonous, until the first tendrils of fog appeared, curling over the asphalt like pale hands reaching from the ditches. Fog isn't unusual here, but this was different. It didn't drift lazily, it surged, swallowing the road in thick, rolling waves. Within seconds, visibility dropped to almost nothing. I slowed to a crawl, knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. The world beyond the glass ceased to exist. My own breath fogged the inside of the windshield, and the boundaries of the car began to feel porous, like the mist was seeping inside. The radio cut out with a sharp burst of static, then silence. Even the tires sounded muted, their usual thrum absorbed by the dense air. My ears popped, and a low vibration settled in my chest, a frequency too deep to be heard, only felt. I remembered reading about infrasound, how certain frequencies can unsettle the human nervous system, sparking paranoia and dread. Scientists have documented its effects in caves, old buildings, even battlefield trenches. Fear, I told myself, could be manufactured. But knowledge doesn't always quiet instinct. Shapes began to move in the fog. At first, I assumed they were tricks of the light, random swirls of moisture playing at being solid. But the longer I stared, the more they resembled forms. Tall, hunched silhouettes pacing the edges of the road, keeping perfect speed with my car. My pulse spiked. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, even muttered aloud to break the spell. But when I looked again, the shapes were closer. The worst part wasn't seeing them. It was realizing they mimicked me. Each time I shifted in my seat, the shadows shifted, in kind, as though my movements were being reflected by something just out of sight. My own car seemed to double. Its shape echoed in the mist like a mirage. The fog wasn't hiding them. It was showing me, back at myself. A grotesque mirror stretched across the night. Panic clawed at my chest, urging me to slam the accelerator and flee. Instead, I eased forward, scanning for a landmark, a sign, anything to anchor me to reality. The odometer ticked upward, but the mile markers didn't change. It was as if the road had become an infinite loop, replaying the same stretch over and over. Then, through the veil of gray, a figure appeared directly in my headlights. I braked hard, tires screaming, the seatbelt biting into my shoulder. The figure didn't flinch. It just stood there, head cocked, features blurred by fog, but posture unmistakable. My throat went dry as recognition struck. It was me. Same jacket, same stance, same trembling hands. My reflection grinned, or maybe the fog grinned for it, as the mist closed in around my stalled car, thick and hungry, erasing the world beyond the beams of my headlights. I expected my reflection to vanish when challenged, but it held in the beams, pale as frost and sure of its footing. I flicked high to low, swept the wipers. The other me matched perfectly, every tilt and swallow, like a mime hired by the dark. I tapped the horn. The sound folded into the fog and returned dulled, as if the night had chewed it. I cracked the window. Wet cold poured in, carrying a mineral tang like coins in rain. The infrasound deepened, a pressure under the ribs that edited courage into compliance. Pilots warn of false horizons. This felt like one with teeth. I tried to catalog, to narrate, to make an index of fear, but what the fog didn't expect was the stubbornness grief had left behind. I rolled forward inches at a time, and the double slid backward without stepping, pulled on an invisible track. When I braked, it paused, forearms slightly lifted, a marionette awaiting a wire. The hood steamed. Droplets marched. In the rear view, the road behind dissolved to nothing, the mirror a black postage stamp. I remembered learning to drive with my mother's bracelet sliding on the wheel, charms chiming when we laughed. She taught me to read fog, slow, steady, never outrun your headlights. The memory felt like a hand on my shoulder, a small warmth in refrigerated air. I breathed with it. The figure breathed with me. We were conjoined metronomes, and one of us was leading. I tried doing the wrong thing on purpose. I signaled left, then turned right. The figure signaled nothing and still turned right, a prediction that hollowed my stomach. I shifted into reverse and crept backward. It advanced without walking, covering the ground I surrendered. Time felt braided, coded like a forgotten map that wanted me lost. The odometer climbed, proof of movement, yet the mile marker remained 117, a silver nail hammered into the same yard of night. I tossed a half-empty bottle out. 10 seconds later it rolled from the fog ahead, ticking like a metronome. I whispered my name to anchor myself to a history. The mist mouthed it back as if trying on sizes. If a predator knows your rhythm, change. The music. I killed the headlights. Darkness fell like a curtain stitched with water. For 3 beats I counted breath, heart, breath. The figure did not disappear. It glowed faintly, not with light, but with intention, the way a remembered face glows behind closed eyes. The engine idled. The road hummed. I turned the radio to static and let the white noise roar, a blizzard to salt the air. The fog thickened, shaping my outline in the glass until I felt watched from the windshield outward. I dropped the car into drive and surged through it. Cold slid over me like a wet sheet. The seat shuddered. For a breath, I believed I'd broken the loop. The road bent and fed me back to the same painted seam. My copy waited, patient and smiling, as if teaching kindergarten to fear. I laughed once, brittle, then quieted. Out of habit more than hope, I checked the mirror. In the black square, a pale coin now brightened, small, distant, and rising. A second set of headlights was appearing behind quiet rebellion, a way to escape the static of human life and sink into something older, wilder. The forest at night feels like a cathedral stripped of stone, its ceiling stitched from branches and stars. My headlamp painted narrow tunnels through the darkness, revealing only fragments, the silver flash of a moth's wings, a patch of moss glowing like moonlight caught in velvet. My boots whispered over damp earth, and for a while that was the only sound. Then I heard it. A thin, breathy murmur, so soft I thought it might be the wind playing tricks. It slithered through the pines, threading itself between the chirp of crickets and the distant call of an owl. At first, it was just noise, indistinct and formless, like water boiling far away. I told myself it was pareidolia, the brain's reflexive need to turn randomness into meaning. Just as we see faces in clouds or hear phantom voices in static, my mind was sculpting the wind into words it wanted to find, but the sound persisted. It rose and fell in rhythms that felt deliberate, like syllables carefully woven together. I paused, holding my breath, and the whisper grew clearer, forming something unmistakable. My name. A cold tremor traveled down my spine. My rational mind fought back, shouting explanations. Perhaps there was another hiker nearby, their voice, warped by distance and carried strangely by the terrain. Forest acoustics can play cruel tricks. Sound bends and rebounds, splitting into echoes like glass fracturing into shards. I called out, my voice hoarse and trembling, but no one answered. The forest swallowed my words whole. When I moved forward again, the whisper followed, brushing against my ears as if it had shape. This time, it didn't just say my name. It spoke a secret. 3 words. Simple, impossible, surgical. Words no living soul could know. A memory buried so deeply I sometimes doubted it had truly happened. My knees buckled. It felt like someone had opened a locked drawer inside me and left the contents scattered on the forest floor. Panic warred with awe. I remembered reading about the Wood Wide Web, the underground network of roots and fungi that allows trees to share nutrients and signals, almost like a nervous system. Some scientists even theorize trees can communicate, though never in human terms. Could this forest be speaking through wind and leaf? Its whispers the natural world given terrible voice. As I stumbled deeper into the trees, the air thickened, humid and close, as though the forest was leaning in to listen. My headlamp beam jittered wildly, catching glimpses of strange movement. Branches didn't sway in the wind. They repositioned, subtly and with intent, like limbs reaching to grasp. I wanted to turn back, but the path behind me was gone, devoured by shadow. The whisper crescendoed into a chorus, each tree a mouth, each leaf a tongue. My name repeated, over and over until it no longer sounded like mine. Then, from the darkness ahead, a massive branch shifted and extended toward me, its silhouette unmistakable. A skeletal hand, reaching. I didn't scream. The branch kept coming, joints clicking like knuckles, each twiglet testing the air around. My face, sap-beaded amber and sweet with a sour bite, the smell of childhood pencil shavings. I stepped back and the soil flexed under my boots as if a lung had exhaled beneath the duff. Another limb uncoiled behind me there. The forest had angles now, a geometry with intentions. I realized I wasn't hearing wind, I was hearing breath. Offered reason like a charm. Trees registered touch, thigmomorphogenesis. Channels opening, electrical signals sliding the cambium like slow lightning. Fungal networks shuttle warnings. Volatile messages ride the air. The Wood Wide Web is real. I told myself, just not personal. But what I didn't expect was the whisper's pivot from weather to biography. It named the scar on my knee from the culvert, the notebook under floorboards, the lie I told my father, each detail placed with a collector's pin. A branch hooked, my pack's shoulder strap and lifted, gentle as a nurse, then tightened with a creak. I froze, palms open, an animal convincing its shadow to forgive it. I whispered, I'm sorry to no one and to everything. I slid my arms free, letting the pack sag like shed skin, and the branch set it down with ceremonial care. The canopy hissed, leaves speaking in fricatives, then went quiet, the way a congregation pauses, waiting for a name. I thought of how we rub buds to harden saplings, how touch writes muscle into wood. If touch can teach, sound can too. I hummed, a low note, steady as a refrigerator at midnight, then braided in a second tone, until they beat like 2 hearts refusing to agree. Infrasound unsettles. Counter rhythms can break entrainment. The trunks swayed out of sequence, and for a moment the whispers blurred like rain crossing an AM station, a voice losing nouns. A corridor opened, not path but permission, trunks leaning. Away, roots unclenching their knuckles. I moved through, careful, grateful, keeping my headlamp low so the beam felt like apology, not command. Bark brushed my sleeves like old corduroy, but what they didn't expect was the message at the funnel's far end. A burl swollen into an ear, rings rippling like sound made wood. It whispered a sentence I had never said aloud. "You left before." The last story. Grief knocked the hinge from my knees. My mother's final afternoon unspooled. Oxygen hiss, her palm patting the coverlet, a tale about the persimmon that outlived the '83 ice storm. I stepped into the hall to take a call, and when I returned, she was traveling somewhere I couldn't follow. The forest spoke that unfinished paragraph back with the gentleness of a found photograph. Branches softened overhead, a hush like carpet, rolling, then tightened, fibers drawing like sutures on a wound. Then the hush tilted. Roots ahead rose and laced, ribs knitting across the corridor. The air thickened with tannins, tea bitter on my tongue. Something rolled under the soil to my left, a wave of loam. I ran, scraping, jacket teeth screeching on bark like a tearing zipper. I burst into a clearing where foxfire pooled like a lantern. A younger tree pointed toward a seam between roots. A voice braided leaves. "Keep going, human." I lowered my palm and the seam exhaled. Nights in the tower taught me how loud silence can be. The valley below lay like a dark quilt stitched with creek lines, and my world was a square room of glass. I logged humidity, watched cups spin, sipped coffee. Near midnight, the air thinned to crystal, and pine needles fell like metronomes on rock. The first light appeared where no road ran. A single bead gliding above the treetops, it paused, then slid left at a perfect 90 degrees, as clean as a drafter's line. Two more winked on, equidistant, forming a triangle that kept its shape while drifting. Drones, I told myself. Survey work, maybe military. But the choreography argued otherwise. Abrupt stops without overshoot, turns too crisp for inertia, paths that tessellated the valley like a glowing grid laid over muscle and bone. I radioed dispatch to log unusual activity, and the speaker answered with a hiss like rain on foil. Then a voice returned shaped exactly like mine, only older by static. It repeated my message before I finished sending it. Tropospheric ducting can bend transmissions. Nights like this, the sky becomes a polished hallway for radio ghosts. Still, when the voice repeated my childhood nickname, one I had never used on air, the hallway felt domestic. I set the binoculars to infinity and steadied my elbows on the map table. Through glass, the lights sharpened, each a point with no halo, moving in ratios that suggested intention. 3 beats forward, 1 beat still, then a right-angle dive as if following invisible streets. I triangulated with the rangefinder and my topo, drawing lines that converged on the old burn scar, the scar that flowers with fireweed in July like a bruise learning to bloom. But what I didn't expect was the pattern echoing the section lines on my topo as if someone were redrawing the land beneath me. To test myself, I killed the interior lamp and let the room revert to ink. Stars blossomed. The procession continued, faint as breath on glass. I tried to outpace fear with math, acceleration profiles, battery limits. My mentor taught me to doubt spectacle, flames, love attention. Yet my body read a different memo. The hairs along my forearms rose like meadow grass before weather, and my pulse learned the light's meter. Leaning over the window to bury reflections, I still saw the room behind me, the desk, rendered faintly in the pane. A shape stood in that reflected room that wasn't in mine. Humanoid, tall, head slightly cocked, as if waiting for a cue. I turned. Only boards, maps, the red eye of the radio. In the glass, the figure didn't turn. It drew closer, detail smearing, like watercolor in rain. If it were an angle trick, it would obey. It didn't. I lifted the binoculars again, but the reflection held them first. The silhouette raised an identical pair to a face the glass refused to resolve, and for a breath, the lenses glinted with the same small moons as mine. The radio crackled, imitating my throat clear, and somewhere in the valley the lights pivoted as one to face the tower. I felt a childish urge to wave, and an older urge to drop to the floor. Something in the glass began to breathe, slowly, quietly. I couldn't tell which impulse belonged to me or who had been the watcher. Fogging the pain inside the reflection, ovals that never reached my side. I tested reality with a childish ritual. Inhale 4, hold 4, exhale 4, and the ghost mist ignored my timing. Optics has rules. Fresnel reflections fade when light dies and angles change. Yet when I leaned, the other room kept its weather, a terrarium of breath and patience. I spoke into the radio with my measurement voice, steady, dull, and read a bearing to the burn scar. The speaker answered in my cadence, then added a detail, only I should know. The scar smells like matches after rain. My mentor said solitude makes you hear yourself louder. Maybe this was feedback, a loop blooming like mold. But what it didn't expect was refusal. I clicked the radio off and let silence keep count. Outside, the lights abandoned geometry and aligned on a single line toward the tower, a runway above fir crowns. The floor vibrated faintly, a purr through my boots. I stepped onto the catwalk, grating cold and damp, and the night rose around me like a well. The air tasted metallic. St. Elmo's fire crawled along the railing in blue flickers. Below, the valley waited with its hands behind its back. I trained the binoculars on the glass instead of the valley. The figure returned the favor, binocular, moons bright. My own reflection lingered too, faint, layered under the intruder like a palimpsest no one had erased. Between us, the window became an aquarium where two specimens learned to mimic. I lifted my left hand. It lifted its right. I willed stillness. It smiled, small, proprietary, pleased to own my restraint. Metal pooled under my tongue. I needed a control. I tore a map page, section 23, drainage gullies like veins on a pale leaf, and taped it to the pane. On my side, paper. In the reflection, the page appeared a beat later, creased, written in my hand. The note read, "Do not turn around." My mouth went desert dry to the root. Behind me, the radio clicked alive and voices hurried past like leaves in a culvert, each shaped like me, fretted by different years. I turned anyway, slowly, giving the note time to be wrong. No one stood in the room. Only the radio's red eye pulsed. In the valley, the lights brightened and stacked, floor after floor, until the horizon lifted. A second tower formed out of night air, story by story, windows filling with glow. It was my tower extruded from the valley, a negative cast, pushing upward through black resin. Doubt broke into wonder the way ice breaks into river. If I were a lens, what image would I serve? I stepped to the door and started down the stairs, my headlamp's circle gliding like a coin down a well. Halfway, a draft breathed up, carrying coffee, pencil shavings, and rain on tin. The smell of this room already occupied. Boots creaked below, matching my weight but a beat late, as if learning me one stair at a time. On the landing window, darkness held the valley like a kept promise. Far below, a knob turned and hinges whispered, "Open." For an instant, I couldn't tell which version of me had reached the ground floor, and whether the lights were guiding me out or welcoming me in. The forest was supposed to be silent, but tonight it hummed. A low, vibrating thrum, like the background noise of a machine hidden beneath the earth. I'd spent weeks here, alone, gathering evidence, chasing stories I once dismissed as campfire lies. Dogman tracks etched deep into mud, whistles at night that answered themselves with perfect mimicry. Hikers disappearing, leaving shoes neatly tied in circles of grass. Lights dancing in geometric patterns over valleys where no roads should run. Each incident felt separate, isolated, but when I pinned their locations to a map, they began to converge like veins, leading to a single, beating heart. I crouched at my campsite, my notebook spread open like a confession. In its pages, the tales, head shape, testimonies from rangers who'd seen glowing eyes in the dark, satellite data showing magnetic anomalies, even fragments of recordings from radios that should have been silent. Patterns emerged, weaving Dogman legends with Skinwalker myths. biological anomalies with psychological warfare. What if I thought these weren't independent nightmares at all? What if they were symptoms of one underlying phenomenon, the way fever and rash point to the same hidden disease? I wrote late into the night, cross-referencing myth with science. Skinwalker tales spoke of transformation, of humans becoming something other. Dogman sightings suggested a predator evolved to exploit our deepest fears. Missing hikers, erased, without trace, became variables in a larger equation. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not by an animal, but by an intelligence observing from just beyond the visible spectrum. The lights I'd seen days ago returned in memory, moving with geometric precision, as if mapping the forest the way a surveyor maps territory before claiming it. The deeper I theorized, the more the forest itself seemed to lean inward, branches knitting tighter overhead. My lantern's glow felt swallowed, not by darkness, but by intent, as if the trees wanted me blind. I forced myself to keep writing, the pen scratching like insect legs, until one detail stopped me cold. Every story, no matter how different, shared a single motif: mimicry. Dogmen mimicked wolves but were not wolves. Skinwalkers mimicked humans but betrayed themselves in small ways. Even the lights mirrored the grid lines of maps, a reflection of human order twisted into alien geometry. What if the forest was mimicking me? The thought landed like a stone in a still pond, rippling outward. My research wasn't uncovering monsters, it was feeding them. By studying fear, I'd been teaching it my shape, my habits, my vulnerabilities. Maybe this place didn't just house nightmares. Maybe it grew them, cultivating stories like bacteria in a petri dish. A breeze stirred, carrying a faint metallic smell, and I packed my notes with shaking hands. Dawn was coming, and with it, the chance to leave. I kicked dirt over the fire and shouldered my pack, whispering a promise to myself. This would end when I stepped out of the tree line. I would carry my findings to civilization, expose the pattern, warn others before it consumed them too. But then I saw them, footprints in the mud, perfectly fresh, leading away from my camp. The tread was unmistakable. They were mine. Only they. Didn't lead towards safety. They led deeper into the forest. The sight of those footprints rooted me to the spot. They weren't just similar to mine. They were exact. Every scuff, every slightly inward tilt of my right foot replicated perfectly, as if the forest had pressed its memory into the soil. I crouched down, running trembling fingers along one print. The mud was still wet, the edges sharp. Whatever had made them had done so moments ago. The only problem was, I hadn't walked that way. My throat tightened. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see some stalker lurking at the tree line. But there was nothing, just a wall of shadows and mist, breathing slowly like some vast animal. I considered calling out, but my voice felt like a weapon turned inward. The stories I'd studied all came rushing back in a wave. Skinwalkers whispering in human voices, dogmen pacing the tents of campers, lights that could imitate human movement with surgical precision. This wasn't random terror. It was deliberate mimicry. I forced myself to follow the prints, each step heavier than the last. The forest grew unnaturally quiet, as if sound itself had been stripped away. Even the usual rustle of leaves and nocturnal insects was gone, replaced by a low hum that vibrated in my teeth. I recognized it from recordings I'd captured earlier, an infrasound frequency known to induce fear and hallucinations in humans. Maybe this was why so many hikers panicked and vanished, I thought. Maybe they never stood a chance. The trail curved sharply, then opened into a clearing I'd never seen before, though some part of me felt it had been waiting for me all along. In the center stood a monolithic stone slab, its surface covered with markings. I shone my flashlight across them and froze. They weren't ancient symbols or primitive warnings. They were diagrams. I recognized the geometric paths of the lights I'd seen in the valley, the spirals of search and rescue grids, even outlines of human skeletal structure. It was as if the forest itself was cataloging us, learning our design like a scientist studying lab rats. A whisper curled through the clearing, soft and mocking, "My name." I spun around, but no one was there. The sound came again, this time from my own lips. My jaw moved without my consent, forming words I didn't understand, while my body stood frozen like a puppet. Terror surged through me. The footprints had been a breadcrumb trail, not leading me to safety, but luring me here to become part of the experiment. The hum intensified, rattling the stone, and the mist thickened until the trees vanished entirely. I saw visions in the fog, dogman eyes gleaming, skinwalkers shifting form, missing hikers reaching out with blank faces, all connected by invisible threads converging here. Fear wasn't just a reaction, it was the mechanism. By fearing them, we created them, feeding them shape and story until they became real. I bolted, tearing through the mist, desperate to escape, but something moved with me, perfectly in sync. Bursting back onto the trail, I looked down and saw two sets of footprints, now mine and another pair beside them, identical in every way. Up ahead, a shadow broke from the trees. My breath caught. It was me. Same clothes, same pack, even the same frantic eyes. As it raised a hand in greeting, realization struck like a blade. I wasn't documenting the phenomenon, I was the phenomenon. Behind me, the hum grew into a roar, and the forest seemed to laugh as my double stepped forward, erasing the line between nightmare and reality. Subscribe, if you dare.